"Stay back!" The shout ripped through the smoke, but not for me. Gideon, damn fool, was inside. Again. This time the flames clawed higher than any I'd seen. She shouldn't have been alive in there. Shouldn't have been at all. Not built like that. A 7-foot wall of muscle. I knew right then, seeing the fear in her eyes battling the inferno, that Gideon was hooked. What they didn't know, the bastards who set that blaze, was that her quiet strength ran deeper than any fire. They thought she was a curse. They have no idea how her quiet kindness will change everything. The irony? Gideon, burnt out and broken, was about to be resurrected by the very person they sought to destroy. He just didn't know it yet. When he asked her name, she didn't answer. When he asked where she came from, she turned away. But when the old Apache man appeared at his ranch the next morning, Gideon realized the rescue had been the easy part. The fire had started just after sunset. Gideon spotted the smoke rising from the valley near the edge of Apache territory, a place he'd learned to avoid over his 15 years of solitary ranching. Something about the way the flames climbed made him saddle his horse without thinking. He told himself it was just habit, the instinct of a man who'd seen too much death to ignore it when it came calling again. The cabin was small, barely standing even before the fire took hold. Through the collapsed doorway, he could see movement. Someone trapped beneath a fallen beam. Gideon didn't hesitate. He never did when it came to this. The heat seared his face as he pushed inside, his eyes watering from the smoke that filled his lungs like poison. What he found stopped him cold. The person pinned beneath the beam wasn't struggling the way most people would. She lay perfectly still, watching the flames creep closer, with a resignation that looked almost like acceptance. But it was her size that made Gideon's breath catch. She was massive, not fat, but built with a strength that seemed carved from stone itself. Her arms, though trapped, showed muscles that could probably snap a man's neck without effort. For a moment, Gideon wondered if he'd walked into something he didn't understand, something he shouldn't interfere with. Then she looked at him. Her eyes were dark, deep as canyon shadows, and in them he saw something that decided everything. She wasn't afraid of dying. She was afraid of living. That look, that particular brand of resignation, was one he recognized. He'd seen it in his own reflection for years. Gideon grabbed the beam. It didn't move. The woman's eyes widened slightly, the first real emotion she'd shown. But she didn't speak. She just watched him struggle with something that would take 3 normal men to lift. He repositioned his grip, planted his feet, and pulled with everything he had. The wood groaned. His shoulders screamed. Then something inside him, something that had been dead for a long time, roared back to life. The beam shifted inches, then a foot. The woman rolled free just as the roof began collapsing. Gideon didn't remember getting outside. One moment they were inside the inferno. The next they were on the ground 30 yards away, both gasping for air that didn't burn. The cabin folded in on itself with a sound like breaking bones. She sat up slowly, deliberately, and for the first time, Gideon got a full sense of her proportions. She was extraordinary. Her height, her build, everything about her seemed designed to inspire awe or fear. Probably both. Definitely both. He extended his hand to help her stand. She stared at it like he'd offered her a loaded weapon. That's when Gideon noticed her hands. They were covered in old scars, dozens of them, crisscrossing her palms and fingers like a map of violence. These weren't the scars of accidents or work. These were deliberate, methodical. She didn't take his hand. She rose on her own, unsteady, but refusing assistance. And when she finally stood to her full height, Gideon had to tilt his head back to meet her gaze. She studied him for a long moment. Then without a word, she turned and walked into the darkness, disappearing between the trees like smoke. Gideon stood there watching the cabin burn down to nothing, wondering what he just saved, and more importantly, from what he didn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face. That look of resignation, those scarred hands, the way she'd rather die than accept help from a stranger. When the sun rose and he heard the sound of horses approaching his ranch, Gideon already knew his life was about to change. He just didn't know how impossible the change would be. The old Apache man who dismounted wore authority like other men wore coats. 3 younger men flanked him, their faces carefully neutral, but their hands never far from their weapons. The old man's eyes found Gideon immediately, reading him the way a hawk reads the ground before diving. He spoke in English, his accent thick, but his words precise. "You saved my daughter last night." Not a question, a statement. Gideon nodded slowly. The old man's expression didn't change. "Then you must marry her." Gideon's hand froze halfway to his coffee cup. The morning sun cast long shadows across his porch, but suddenly everything felt cold. The old Apache man stood perfectly still, waiting for a response to words that made no sense. Behind him, the 3 younger men shifted their weight, hands resting near their weapons with practiced casualness. Marry her. Just like that, as if saving someone from a fire automatically created a debt that could only be paid with a lifetime commitment, Gideon set the cup down carefully, buying himself seconds to think. His mind raced through possible responses, each one dying before it reached his mouth. This wasn't a request he could laugh off or politely decline. The old man's eyes held the weight of something far more serious than gratitude. "I don't understand," Gideon finally said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest. The old man's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "My name is Taza. The woman you saved is Nalnish, my daughter, my only child." He paused and something flickered across his face. Pain, perhaps, or shame. "Among my people, a life debt must be honored. But there is more than tradition at stake here." Gideon waited, his rancher's instincts telling him to stay silent and let the other man reveal what he needed to say. Taza's next words came slower, heavier. "Nalnish cannot return to our village. She will be harmed if she does, perhaps killed." He said it without emotion, stating a fact as simple as the color of the sky. "You are the only man who has shown her kindness without fear. You risked your life when you had nothing to gain. This makes you worthy." The logic was insane. Gideon had pulled a stranger from a burning building, something any decent person would do. Now he was being told his reward for basic humanity was to upend his entire existence. Worthy of what, exactly? Gideon asked, though he already knew the answer would only make things worse. Of protecting her, of giving her a place where she can exist without persecution. Taza took a step closer, and despite his age, there was nothing frail about the movement. "I am asking you to give my daughter what I cannot. Safety." The word hung between them like smoke. Safety. Such a simple thing to ask for. Such an impossible thing to provide. Gideon thought of his 15 years of solitude, of the careful life he'd built on the edges of civilization, where no one asked questions and he owed nothing to anyone. He thought of the woman from last night, her massive frame, her scarred hands, the way she'd looked at him like he was another threat instead of her salvation. "Why me?" Gideon asked. "Why not one of your own people?" Taza's expression hardened. "Because my own people are the danger." The statement landed like a physical blow. Gideon had heard stories of tribal conflicts, of people cast out for breaking sacred laws or challenging tradition. But this felt different, more personal, more desperate. What did she do? The question came out before Gideon could stop it. "She was born," Taza said simply. Everything else followed from that. One of the younger men behind Taza shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward the Trion as if expecting trouble. Taza noticed the movement and his voice took on an edge of urgency. "I am not asking you to love her. I am not asking you to want this. I am asking you to honor the life debt and keep her alive." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch, setting it on the porch railing. "This is all I can offer in return. But know this, if you refuse, I will understand. And Nalnish will be dead within the week." Gideon stared at the pouch, his mind reeling. Taza had just handed him an impossible choice, wrapped in a death sentence. Refuge and a woman dies because he chose his comfortable solitude. Accept and tie himself forever to someone he didn't know. Didn't understand, and frankly wasn't sure he wanted to understand. "I need time to think," Gideon said. Taza nodded slowly. "You have until sunset. After that, we must move her regardless of your answer." He turned to leave, then paused. "She is at the creek beyond your eastern pasture. She refused to come closer to your home. I suggest you speak with her before you decide." The four men mounted their horses and rode off, leaving Gideon alone on his porch with a leather pouch and a decision that would define the rest of his life. He didn't open the pouch. He already knew no amount of money or goods could balance this equation. Instead, he stood there as the sun climbed higher, trying to figure out how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. Yesterday, he'd saved a life. Today, that same act might cost him his freedom. The creek was a 20-minute walk through tall grass that hadn't been cut in years. Gideon found himself moving toward it before he'd consciously decided to go. As if his body understood something his mind hadn't caught up to yet. He needed to see her again, needed to understand what Taza was really asking him to protect. What he found at the creek would change everything he thought he knew about impossible choices. She sat on a flat rock near the water's edge, her back to him. But Gideon knew she'd heard him approach. Her posture had shifted, shoulders tensing, head tilting slightly to track his footsteps through the grass. She didn't turn around. In daylight, away from fire and smoke, Nanish looked even more imposing. Her height wasn't the result of illness or deformity. It was simply who she was, built on a scale that nature rarely attempted. Her dark hair hung past her shoulders, and even sitting, she matched Gideon's standing height. He stopped 10 ft away, giving her space. "Your father came to my ranch this morning." No response. She continued staring at the creek as if he hadn't spoken. Gideon tried again. He said, "You can't go home." Said, "They'll hurt you." This time her shoulders moved, a small shrug that somehow conveyed volumes of resignation. When she finally spoke, her voice was deeper than most women's, but clear and steady. "He should have let me burn." The words hit Gideon harder than he expected. He'd heard despair before, recognized it in the mirror often enough. But this was different. This was someone who'd moved past despair into acceptance of their own worthlessness. "I don't believe that," Gideon said. She turned then, those dark eyes finding his, with an intensity that made him want to step back. "You don't know anything about me, about what I am. I know you didn't start that fire yourself. Someone said it. Someone wanted you dead." Her expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, maybe that he'd figured it out so quickly. "Does it matter? One way or another, I was always going to end this way." Gideon moved closer, slowly, the way he'd approach a wounded animal. "Your father asked me to marry you, to keep you safe." Nalnish laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that held no humor. "Of course he did. The great Taza trying to solve his embarrassment by giving me to the first white man who showed basic decency." She stood abruptly rising to her full height, and Gideon had to crane his neck to maintain eye contact. "Do you know what I am to my people? A curse, a punishment from the spirits for some crime my mother must have committed." "That's true." She cut him off. "I was born too large, too strong, too different. When I was young, they tried to fix me. Medicine men, shamans, healers who promised they could make me normal." She held up her scarred hands. "These are from the ceremonies, the bindings, the attempts to stop my bones from growing wrong." Gideon stared at those scars with new understanding. Someone had deliberately hurt this woman, repeatedly trying to change something that couldn't be changed. "When nothing worked," Nish continued, her voice flat, "they decided I was possessed, dangerous, something that needed to be isolated before I corrupted others." She took a step toward him, and despite everything, Gideon's instincts screamed at him to retreat. "So they built me that cabin, sent food once a week, pretended I didn't exist, and I let them because at least isolation was better than their ceremonies, until someone decided isolation wasn't enough," Gideon said quietly. She nodded. 3 nights ago, I heard them outside my cabin, young warriors arguing about whether killing me would bring honor or shame to the tribe." Her jaw tightened. "They compromised, set the fire, and left. If I died, it was the spirit's will. If I survived, perhaps the flames would purify me." The casual cruelty of it made Gideon's stomach turn. These weren't enemies or strangers. These were her own people, her own community, deciding her life was worth less than their superstitions. "Your father is trying to protect you," Gideon said. "My father is trying to save face," Nish corrected. He's a leader. He can't openly defy the tribe's judgment without losing his authority, but he also can't let his daughter be murdered without trying something. She looked at Gideon with eyes that had seen too much rejection. So we found you, a white rancher with no ties to our world, someone who could take me off his hands and ease his conscience. Gideon wanted to argue, but he couldn't. He didn't know Taza well enough to judge the man's motivations. All he knew was that right now, in this moment, the woman in front of him needed help, whether she wanted to admit it or not. "What do you want?" he asked. The question seemed to catch her off guard. She blinked, confusion crossing her face, as if no one had ever asked her that before. "I want," she started, then stopped, tried again. "I don't know. I've spent so long trying to survive that I forgot there might be other options." Before Gideon could respond, the sound of horses cut through the morning air, multiple riders moving fast, coming from the direction of Apache territory. Nalish's entire body went rigid. "They found me faster than I thought." "Who?" Gideon asked, though dread was already pooling in his gut. She looked at him with something close to pity. "The ones who want to finish what the fire started." 5 riders emerged from the tree, moving with the confidence of men who knew they outnumbered their target. They weren't dressed for ceremony or diplomacy. These were hunters, and Nalnish was their prey. Gideon stepped between her and the approaching horses, his hand instinctively moving to his hip, though he wore no weapon. It was a stupid reflexive gesture that wouldn't stop anything, but his body moved before his mind could talk him out of it. The lead rider pulled his horse to a stop 20 ft away. He was young, maybe 25, with a face that might have been handsome if it wasn't twisted with disgust. His eyes locked onto Nalish with the kind of hatred that came from deep conviction. "Step aside, white man," he said in heavily accented English. "This is not your concern. She's on my land," Gideon replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "That makes it my concern." The young warrior's jaw tightened. He said something in his own language, sharp and dismissive. Behind Gideon, Nish translated quietly. He says, "I poisoned his brother, made him sick with my presence." "Did you?" Gideon asked, not taking his eyes off the riders. "I've never spoken to his brother, never been near him." Her voice held exhaustion, as if she defended herself from these accusations too many times. But his brother caught fever last winter. Someone had to be blamed. The lead warrior spoke again, this time directing his words at Nalnish. His tone carried the weight of judgment, of righteousness. She didn't translate, but Gideon could hear the venom in every syllable. "Leave," Gideon said, cutting through the warrior's speech. "Now," the young man's eyes narrowed. "You would protect a demon. You would stand against us for something that should have died years ago." Something in Gideon's chest went cold and hard. He'd heard that tone before. The absolute certainty that another human being was less than human. He'd heard it from men who justified every cruelty, every injustice by simply deciding their victim wasn't worth basic decency. "I'm standing against 5 men who rode onto my property to threaten a woman." Gideon said, "Now get off my land before I make you." It was an empty threat, and everyone knew it. 5 armed warriors against 1 unarmed rancher. The math was brutal and simple. The lead warrior smiled, recognizing Gideon's bluff. He dismounted slowly, deliberately, making a show of his authority. The other 4 followed suit, fanning out in a loose semicircle. "You made a mistake, white man," the warrior said, drawing a long knife from his belt. "Taza may have fooled you with his stories, but she is not worth dying for." Gideon's mind raced through possibilities. He was fast, but not fast enough to outrun 5 men. Strong, but not strong enough to fight them all. His ranch house was too far to reach, and even if he made it, his rifle was locked in a cabinet that would take precious seconds to open. He was out of options and out of time. Then Nalish moved. She didn't step forward aggressively or make any threatening gesture. She simply rose to her full height and let the warriors see her completely. All 7 ft of her, every inch of muscle and bone that made her different. That made her terrifying. The effect was immediate. The warriors stopped advancing. 2 of them actually took a step back. Nalnish spoke in her own language, her voice carrying across the creek with absolute authority. Gideon didn't understand the words, but he understood the message. She was challenging them directly, removing Gideon from the equation. The lead warrior's face went pale, then red with rage. He shouted something back, but his voice cracked slightly. Fear, Gideon realized. These men were afraid of her. What did you say? Gideon asked quietly. I told them if they want to kill me, they should try, Nalnish replied. But I won't go quietly. I won't burn or run or make it easy. She took a step forward and the warriors retreated another step. I told them whoever comes for me should make peace with their families first because they won't be going home. It was a bluff. It had to be. But watching the warriors' faces, Gideon wasn't entirely sure. There was something in Nish's stance and the way she carried herself that suggested she meant every word. The lead warrior was caught between his hatred and his fear. Gideon could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. Was killing this woman worth risking his own life? Was his brother's fever worth becoming another body? The standoff stretched for seconds that felt like hours. Then hoof beats shattered the tension. Taza appeared from the north, riding hard with a dozen warriors behind him. He positioned himself between his daughter and the young warriors, his face a mask of controlled fury. The confrontation that followed was entirely in their language, but Gideon didn't need translation. Taza was exercising his authority as a leader, and the young warriors were being forced to back down. But the looks they shot at Nish before mounting their horses promised this wasn't over, not by a long shot. As the 5 riders disappeared into the trees, Taza turned to Gideon. You have until sunset to decide. After that, I cannot protect her, not even from my own people. He rode off without another word, leaving Gideon alone with Nalnish in a decision that had just become infinitely more complicated, because now he understood something crucial. This wasn't just about marriage or tradition or honor. This was about survival, and time was running out faster than anyone wanted to admit. Silence settled over the creek like dust after a storm. Nalnish sat back down on her rock, but her hands were shaking, small tremors that she tried to hide by gripping her knees. But Gideon saw them anyway. The woman who just stared down 5 armed warriors was terrified. You weren't bluffing, Gideon said, sitting on a fallen log nearby. Were you? Nalnish didn't answer immediately. She stared at her scarred palms as if reading something written there in old pain. 3 years ago, a man from the village decided to test whether I was truly cursed. He came to my cabin at night with a knife. Gideon waited, sensing this story needed to be told at its own pace. He thought because I was a woman, I would be easy to overpower. He was wrong. She looked up, meeting Gideon's eyes. I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted him to stop. But when someone my size fights back, even in defense, the results are permanent. The pieces suddenly clicked into place. The fear in the warrior's eyes, the way they'd retreated when she stood. This wasn't superstition or rumor. These men knew firsthand or through stories that Nalnish was dangerous when cornered. What happened after? Gideon asked. Taza covered it up, said the man fell from his horse and broke his neck. Most people believed it because the alternative was admitting one of their warriors had tried to attack a helpless woman and lost. Her voice hardened. But some knew the truth, and those who knew made sure everyone else understood that touching meant risking death. Gideon processed this carefully. So they're afraid of you, but they still want you dead. Fear and hatred often walk together, Nalnish said quietly. They fear what I might do. They hate that I exist at all. The fire was their way of solving both problems without risking direct confrontation. A bird called from somewhere in the trees, its song incongruously cheerful against the weight of their conversation. Gideon watched the creek water flow past, thinking about choices and consequences. If I say no, he started, then paused, making sure he wanted to ask this question. If I refuse your father's proposal, where will you go? Nish considered the question for a long moment. There's a trading post 3 days north run by a French trapper who doesn't care much about local politics. I could try to work there, assuming he doesn't shoot me on sight for being Apache. And if he does, she shrugged, then I keep moving until I find somewhere that will tolerate me or until I can't move anymore. The casual acceptance of her own probable death struck Gideon harder than it should. This woman had been living with a death sentence her entire life. The fire, the warriors, the isolation. These were just the latest attempts in a long campaign to erase her existence. Why did you refuse to come near my ranch house? Gideon asked, changing direction. Your father said you wouldn't get any closer. For the first time, something close to embarrassment crossed Nalnish's face because I didn't want you to feel trapped. You saved my life. I didn't want you to wake up and find me on your property like some obligation you couldn't escape. The consideration in that gesture, the awareness of how her presence might affect him, revealed more about her character than anything else she'd said. Despite everything she'd endured, she still thought about other people's comfort before her own. Gideon stood, brushing dirt from his pants. Come back to the house. Nalish looked up sharply. Why? Because if we're going to have this conversation, we should do it properly. And because you haven't eaten since yesterday, and I'm not letting you starve on my land while I figure out what to do. She didn't move. I'm not asking you to save me again. I know, Gideon said. I'm not asking your permission. Something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, maybe, or the first hint of hope. She stood slowly, and together they walked back through the tall grass toward his ranch house. They were halfway there when Gideon heard the sound that changed everything. A woman's scream, high and desperate, coming from the direction of his barn. He broke into a run, Nalnish keeping pace beside him despite her size. They rounded the corner of the house and stopped dead. A wagon had overturned near the barn entrance. A woman knelt beside it, trying desperately to lift one side. Underneath, barely visible, was a small child. Help! The woman shouted when she saw them. My son is trapped. Please, the wheel is crushing him. Gideon sprinted forward, his mind already calculating angles and leverage points. The wagon was heavy, built for hauling supplies, and the wheel had the child pinned at the chest. The boy wasn't moving. Gideon grabbed the wagon's frame and pulled. It barely shifted. The woman was crying now, begging, her hands bleeding from trying to claw at the wooden wheel. It's too heavy, Gideon gasped, pulling harder. His muscles screamed, but the wagon wouldn't budge. The boy's face was turning blue. Then Nish was there. She positioned herself beside Gideon, wrapped her hands around the wagon's frame, and lifted. The wagon rose slowly at first, then steadily as if it weighed nothing at all. The woman dragged her son free, cradling him as he gasped for air. Nalnish held the wagon up until Gideon helped prop it with a beam. Then she stepped back, breathing hard but steady. The woman looked up at Nish, her face wet with tears and gratitude. Then her eyes widened as she truly saw who had saved her child. Her expression shifted from gratitude to recognition, to something that looked horribly like fear. You're the giant, she whispered, pulling her son closer. The cursed one. And Gideon realized their decision had just been made for them in the worst possible way. The woman gathered her son and scrambled backward, putting distance between herself and Nalish, as if proximity alone could cause harm. The boy was coughing, breathing again, alive because of the person his mother now looked at with naked terror. Thank you, the woman managed to say, but the words came out strangled, forced. Her eyes never left Nalnish, tracking her like a predator. Nalnish stood perfectly still, her face carefully blank. Gideon recognized that expression now. It was the same one she'd worn in the burning cabin. Resignation, the knowledge that no good deed would ever be enough to overcome what she was. Your son needs water, Gideon said, breaking the tension, and you should check for broken ribs. Come inside. The woman's eyes snapped to him and he saw the calculation happening. Accept help from the man who harbored a demon or refuse and risk her child's health. I can't, she whispered. I'm sorry, I can't. She climbed onto the overturned wagon seat, pulling her son onto her lap and urged the remaining horse forward. The animal struggled against the unbalanced weight, but eventually the wagon lurched away, leaving deep ruts in the dirt. Gideon watched them go, anger building in his chest. That boy was alive because of Nish. The mother knew it, and still she fled as if staying would doom them both. This is why I stayed at the creek, Nish said quietly. She hadn't moved from where she'd set down the wagon. People see me and all they can think about is what I might do, not what I actually did. Before Gideon could respond, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The woman's wagon was heading south, directly toward the nearest settlement, a cluster of homesteads and a small trading post about 6 miles away. She would talk, of course, she would. She'd tell everyone about the giant Apache woman staying at Gideon Pratt's ranch. She'd describe how Nish had lifted that wagon with impossible strength, and because fear made people stupid, they'd forget the part about saving a child and remember only that something unnatural lived nearby. "We need to leave," Nalish said, reading his expression. "Now before that woman brings back half the territory." "Where would you go?" Gideon asked. She shook her head. "Not we, me. You've done more than enough. I won't let you lose your home because of my existence." The word choice struck him, not because of me, but because of my existence. As if her mere presence in the world was the problem, not the fear and hatred of everyone around her. Gideon looked at his ranch house, at the land he'd carved from wilderness through 15 years of backbreaking work. He thought about the isolation he'd chosen, the walls he'd built to keep the world at a safe distance. He'd convinced himself that solitude was freedom, but watching Nalnish prepare to walk away into certain death, he realized he'd been lying to himself for years. Isolation wasn't freedom. It was just a different kind of prison. "The sun's about halfway to setting," Gideon said, checking its position. "Your father gave me until sunset to decide." He turned to face her fully. "I'm deciding now." Nish's expression flickered, hope and fear wearing across her features. "Don't make this choice because you feel sorry for me." "I'm not," Gideon said, and realized it was true. "I'm making it because those warriors are going to come back, and when they do, they'll have numbers. And because that woman is spreading stories right now that will turn every homesteader within 50 mirror into your enemy." He took a step closer. "I'm making it because if I let you walk away, you'll be dead within 3 days and I'll have to live knowing I could have stopped it." "You don't owe me anything," she said, but her voice shook slightly. "No," Gideon agreed. "But maybe I owe myself something. Maybe I'm tired of watching people suffer because it's easier than standing up." The words hung between them, heavy with implications neither fully understood yet. Nish studied him for a long moment. "You understand what you're agreeing to? This isn't a temporary arrangement. Among my people, marriage is binding forever. There's no changing your mind in a year when you realize what a mistake this was." "I understand. You'll be tied to someone everyone fears. Your neighbors will avoid you. They'll whisper. Some might even try to drive you out." Her voice hardened. "You'll lose everything you've built here. Then we'll build somewhere else," Gideon said simply. She blinked, surprised. "We? You think I'm marrying you just to leave you on your own?" Despite everything, Gideon almost smiled. "That defeats the whole purpose." Nalnish opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. "I don't understand you. That makes 2 of us," Gideon admitted. "But we've got the rest of our lives to figure it out." The sound of horses approaching cut off whatever she might have said next. Gideon turned to see Taza riding toward them alone, his weathered face unreadable in the afternoon light. The old man dismounted slowly, his eyes moving between Gideon and Nalnish, reading the space between them like tracks in dirt. "You have made your choice," Taza said. "Not a question." "I have," Gideon confirmed. Taza nodded once, then reached into his coat and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in leather. "Then we must do this now before the settlers come, before my warriors return." He looked at his daughter, and for the first time Gideon saw genuine pain in the old man's eyes. "I am sorry it had to be this way." Nalish's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Taza unwrapped the bundle, revealing what looked like ceremonial items. Nothing elaborate, just simple objects that carried the weight of tradition. A binding requires a witness and an exchange of promises. Taza said, "I will serve as witness. The promises you must make yourselves." Gideon looked at Nalnish, at this woman he barely knew, who he was about to bind himself to for life. She looked back at him with eyes that held a question she couldn't quite voice, and somewhere in the distance, growing closer, Gideon heard the sound of many horses. Time had run out. The approaching horses grew louder, at least a dozen riders, maybe more. Taza heard them too. His face remained calm, but his movements became more urgent as he arranged the ceremonial items on a flat rock. "We don't have time for the full ritual," Taza said. "We'll do the binding. That's all that matters legally and spiritually." Gideon glanced toward the sound of hoof-beat tats. "How long? 5 minutes? Maybe less." Taza positioned himself so he could see both the path and his daughter. "Stand facing each other." Gideon and Nal Nish moved to comply. She stood a full head taller than him, forcing Gideon to tilt his chin up to maintain eye contact. In any other circumstance, the height difference would have been comical. Now it just felt surreal. In my culture, Taza began speaking quickly. Marriage is about protection and partnership, not love, not romance. Those may come later, or they may not. What matters is the commitment to stand together against the world. He looked at Gideon. Do you understand this? I do. Taza turned to his daughter. Nalnish, this man offers you his name, his home, and his protection. Do you accept? She hesitated, her eyes searching Gideon's face as if trying to find the lie, the trick, the inevitable betrayal. She'd been hurt too many times to trust easily. The horses were close enough now that Gideon could hear individual voices shouting to each other. We're running out of time, Taza said softly. Nalish took a breath. I accept, Gideon Pratt, Taza continued. This woman offers you her loyalty, her labor, and her presence in your life until death. Do you accept? The phrasing was deliberately transactional, stripping away any pretense of romance. This was a contract, not a love story. Gideon appreciated the honesty. I accept. Taza picked up a length of woven cord from his ceremonial items among my people. We bind the hands to symbolize the binding of lives, but we don't have time for that. Instead, he took Gideon's right hand and placed it against Nish's left palm. Her hand was massive compared to his, scarred and calloused from years of isolation and hard living. But her grip when she closed her fingers around his was surprisingly gentle. In the eyes of the spirits, in the eyes of the earth, in the eyes of those who witness, Taza said, his voice carrying ritual weight despite the rushed circumstances. You are now bound. What was two is now one. This cannot be undone. He wrapped the cord around their joined hands once, symbolic rather than functional, then removed it. It's done, Taza said. She is now your responsibility, your burden, your family. The words should have felt heavy, oppressive. Instead, Gideon felt something unexpected. Relief, like he'd finally made a decision that mattered after years of making none at all. Nish pulled her hand back slowly, staring at her palm as if expecting to see some visible change. When she looked up at Gideon, her expression was unreadable. The riders burst into view. Not Apache warriors this time, but settlers. Rough men from the homesteads, led by a thick-necked farmer Gideon recognized from the trading post. They carried rifles, pitchforks, improvised weapons. Behind them, looking pale and frightened, was the woman whose son Nalish had saved. There, someone shouted, pointing at Nalnish. That's the one Martha described. The mob pulled their horses to a stop, forming a loose semicircle around Gideon's property. The farmer who'd led them raised his rifle, not quite pointing it at anyone yet, but the threat was clear. Pratt, he called out. Step away from that thing. We're here to handle this before someone gets hurt. Taza moved to stand beside his daughter, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. The old man looked small next to Nalnish, but his presence carried authority that made several of the settlers shift nervously. Gideon stepped forward, positioning himself between the mob and his. He stumbled mentally over the word. His wife. You're on my land, Gideon said, his voice carrying across the distance. And you're threatening my family. The word family hung in the air like a gunshot. Several settlers exchanged confused glances. Your family? The farmer's face twisted with disgust. That's no family. That's a monster. Martha said it lifted a wagon like it was nothing. That ain't natural. That ain't human. That woman saved Martha's son from dying. Gideon shot back. Where's the monster in that? Don't matter what it did, another settler yelled. It shouldn't exist. The Apache know it. That's why they tried to burn it. The logic was circular and vicious, fed by fear and the human need to destroy what they didn't understand. Gideon had seen this before in different contexts, different targets. The pattern was always the same. Her name is Nal Nish, Gideon said, emphasizing the word her, and as of 5 minutes ago, she's my wife. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the horses seemed to sense the shock rippling through the crowd. You married it? The farmer's voice rose in disbelief. Are you insane? You brought a curse onto your own head. I made a choice, Gideon replied. Same choice I'm making now. You want to hurt my wife? You go through me first. The farmer's face flushed red. He raised his rifle fully now, pointing it directly at Gideon's chest. Then maybe we go through you. Taza's hand tightened on his knife. Nalnish took a step forward, placing herself partially in front of Gideon, protecting him despite being the one everyone wanted dead. The tension stretched like wire about to snap. Then a new voice cut through the standoff, cold and authoritative. Lower your weapons now. Everyone turned to see a man on horseback approaching from the east. He wore a badge pinned to his vest. Territorial marshal, the kind of authority that transcended local feuds and mob justice. The marshal surveyed the scene with practiced eyes, taking in the armed settlers, the Apache elder, the unusually tall woman, and Gideon standing between all of them. Someone want to explain? The marshal said slowly. Why, I just rode into what looks like a lynching. The marshal dismounted with the careful movements of a man who diffused too many powder kegs to rush. He was older than Gideon expected, maybe 60, with gray threading through his dark beard, and eyes that had seen every variation of human stupidity. Marshal Keene, he introduced himself, though he didn't offer his hand. Someone want to start talking before I arrest all of you for disturbing the peace? The farmer with the rifle lowered it slightly, but his jaw remained set. This man harbors a dangerous creature, Marshal. We got a right to protect our families. That's how Keene's eyes moved to Nalnish, studying her without the fear or disgust the settler showed. Just clinical assessment. You kill anyone, ma'am? Nalnish hesitated, then spoke clearly. One man 3 years ago, he came to kill me first. Self-defense witnesses. Her father witnessed the aftermath. Gideon interjected. Taza here. He's a respected leader among the Apache. Keene looked at Taza, who nodded once. The marshal seemed to consider this, then turned back to the settlers. Self-defense ain't murder. That's law, not opinion, he gestured at the mob. What I see here is a dozen armed men threatening a woman on private property. That's not protection, that's a crime. But she's not natural, another settler shouted. Look at her. Being tall isn't illegal, Keene said flatly. Being different isn't illegal. Hell, being Apache isn't even illegal, though. Some of you act like it should be. His voice hardened. What is illegal is forming a lynch mob. So unless someone can give me actual evidence of an actual crime, you boys are going home now. The farmer's face flushed red. You're just going to let this stand. Let Pratt keep that thing on his land. That thing, Gideon said, his voice dangerously quiet, is my wife? Show some respect or get off my property. Several settlers actually flinched at the word wife. Martha, the woman whose son had been saved, looked like she might be sick. Marshal Keene's eyebrows rose slightly. Your wife that legal? Witnessed in binding? Taza confirmed. 5 minutes ago, Apache ceremony, but recognized by territorial law regarding indigenous marriages. Keene nodded slowly. Then it settled. These folks are married. What they do on their own land is their business. He fixed the settlers with a hard stare. Anyone got a problem with that? You take it up with a judge, not with rifles and pitchforks. The mob shifted uncertainly, their righteous anger deflating under the weight of actual authority. Without the fuel of mob mentality, they were just frightened neighbors who'd let fear override reason. This isn't over, the farmer muttered, but he was already turning his horse around. Yeah, it is, Keene replied. And if I hear about anyone bothering the Pratts, I'll be back, and I won't be polite. The settlers dispersed slowly, shooting dark looks over their shoulders, but lacking the courage to defy a territorial marshal. Within minutes, they were gone, leaving only dust and the memory of how close everything had come to violence. Keene watched them go, then turned to Gideon. You know what you've done? Made a choice, Gideon said. Made yourself an outcast, Keene corrected. Those settlers won't forget, won't forgive. You'll be welcome nowhere within 50 memor. Then we'll go somewhere else. The marshal studied him for a long moment, then surprised Gideon by almost smiling. Stubborn. Good. You'll need it. He looked at Nalnish. You got lucky finding this one, ma'am. Most men would have let the mob have you just to save their own skin. I know, Nalnish said quietly. Keen mounted his horse, preparing to leave. Then he paused. There's territory opening up further west, past the mineral claims. Good land, plenty of water, far enough from settlements that folks won't bother you much. He adjusted his reins. Just a suggestion from someone who's seen too many good people destroyed by bad neighbors. With that, he rode off, leaving Gideon, Nalnish, and Taza alone in the settling dust. Taza approached his daughter, his weathered face showing emotions he'd kept carefully hidden until now. I chose this man, he said, speaking to her in English so Gideon would understand, because 15 years ago he lost his wife and child to sickness. He knows grief. He knows isolation. The old man's voice roughened. And because when I watched him from the ridge last night, I saw him pull you from that fire without hesitation, without fear, without calculating what it would cost him. Gideon stiffened. You were watching? I needed to know what kind of man you were before I asked this of you. Tussa looked between them. Some men are brave only when it benefits them. You are brave even when it destroys you. That is the kind of man who could protect my daughter. He reached out and touched Nalish's scarred hand gently. I failed you. Let them hurt you. Let them make you believe you were less than human. His voice broke slightly. This is my way of making it right. Giving you to someone who will see you as I should have, as worthy of protection, of life, of dignity. Nalish's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. Instead, she squeezed her father's hand once, a gesture that said more than words could. Taza mounted his horse. I will not see you again. It would endanger you both if I did. But know this, you are no longer alone, either of you. He rode away without looking back, leaving Gideon and Nalnish standing in front of the ranch house as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. They were married. They were outcasts. They were bound together by impossible circumstances and a ceremony performed under threat of death. And somehow, against all logic, Gideon felt more free than he had in 15 years. The house felt different with another person inside. Gideon had lived alone for so long that even the sound of someone else breathing in the next room seemed foreign. He stood at the window watching the last light fade from the sky, aware of Nish sitting at his table behind him. She hadn't spoken since they'd come inside, just sat there, hands folded in her lap, waiting for something. Instructions maybe, or rejection once the reality of what he'd agreed to fully sank in. We should leave, Gideon said, breaking the silence. Head west like the marshal suggested. Start fresh somewhere people don't know our story. When her voice was steady, practical. 3 days time enough to pack what matters, sell what doesn't. He turned to face her. I'm not sentimental about this place. It was just somewhere to hide. Nish looked around the sparse room. Simple furniture, bare walls, nothing that suggested anyone actually lived here, just existed. 15 years in one place, and you call it hiding. What would you call it? She considered the question carefully, waiting maybe for something worth coming back to life for? The observation was too accurate, too close to truths Gideon had avoided examining. He told himself he chose solitude, that he preferred isolation, but really he'd just been frozen in place, unable to move forward or back, stuck in the moment his family died. What about you? Gideon asked. What were you doing in that cabin all those years? The same thing, Nalnish admitted, waiting to die, just taking longer than expected. They sat with that honesty for a moment. Two people who'd given up on living, suddenly forced to figure out how to do it together. I don't know how to be married, Gideon said finally, especially like this. No courtship, no time to know each other. Nothing but circumstances forcing us together. I don't know how to be anything except alone, Nish replied. I'm not asking you to love me. I'm not even asking you to like me. Just don't regret this. Not out loud, at least. The vulnerability in that request struck Gideon hard. She expected rejection even from the man who'd married her to save her life. Come here, he said. She rose slowly, uncertainty in every movement, and crossed the room. Standing this close, the height difference was even more pronounced. Gideon had to crane his neck back to meet her eyes. I'm going to tell you something, Gideon said, and I need you to believe it because I won't repeat it. He held her gaze. I don't regret this. Not the marriage, not the choice, none of it. What I regret is that the world made this necessary, that people treated you so badly that death looked preferable to living. Nalnish's throat worked as she swallowed hard. You don't know me well enough to mean that. I know enough. I know you'd rather die than accept help, but you helped me anyway when those warriors came. I know you lifted that wagon to save a child who'd never thank you. I know you've survived years of treatment that would have broken most people. He reached up and took her scarred hand. That's enough to know you're worth protecting. For the first time since he'd met her, Nalnish's carefully controlled expression cracked. Tears welled in her eyes, not of sadness, but of something deeper. Relief, maybe, or recognition that someone finally saw her as human. I'll try not to be a burden, she whispered. You'll fail, Gideon said bluntly, because everyone's a burden sometimes. That's what marriage is, agreeing to carry each other when needed. He squeezed her hand gently. But I'll try not to be one either, and we'll both fail at that too, and we'll figure it out anyway. The ghost of a smile touched her lips. That's a terrible foundation for a marriage. Better than most get, Gideon replied. Over the next 3 days, they prepared to leave. Gideon sold his livestock to a neighboring rancher who needed them more than answers about why. They packed only what 2 horses could carry, tools, supplies, and very little else. The land itself, Gideon simply abandoned. It wasn't worth the trouble of selling, and whoever wanted it badly enough could claim it. On the morning of their departure, Nalnish stood outside the ranch house one last time, looking at the place that had been her husband's home for 15 years. Any regrets? She asked. Gideon tightened the straps on his horse's saddle. Only that I didn't leave sooner. They rode west together as the sun climbed higher, 2 outcasts heading toward territory where maybe possibly they could build something that resembled a life. They didn't speak much during the journey, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the quiet of 2 people who understood that words weren't always necessary. A week into their travel, they found the land the marshal had mentioned. A valley with good water, sheltered from harsh winds, far enough from settlements that curious eyes wouldn't find them. They built a small cabin together, Nish's strength making the work go faster than Gideon ever could have managed alone. Months passed, then a year. The neighbors they eventually acquired were sparse and minded their own business, which suited both of them fine. Nish learned that not everyone feared her, and Gideon learned that isolation had never been the freedom he'd convinced himself it was. They never spoke of love. That wasn't what they'd agreed to, but they built something arguably more valuable: partnership, respect, and the knowledge that neither of them had to face the world alone anymore. Gideon had saved her from fire. She'd saved him from a different kind of burning, the slow consumption of living without purpose. The impossible request had led to an impossible life. But sometimes, Gideon thought as he watched Nellish work in their garden one spring morning, impossible was exactly what both of them had needed all along. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where courage and choices reshape destinies in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.